Welcome to the Base Path Podcast, brought to you by New England Baseball Journal. I'm your host, Dan Guttenplan, and I'm here with Pat Donnelly, who has been on the MIAA beat all season for us. Today, we are doing instant reactions to the MIAA Baseball brackets. They were released, we're actually sitting down here at about 11:30. They were released a half an hour ago. So we're going to kind of go right off the dome here and talk about our reactions to the brackets, who we like in this tournament, some of the bigger, games to watch here in the first round and the first couple rounds. We'll probably reconvene in a couple weeks before the championship games and, talk about everything that happened in the tournament. But right now, we're just reacting to the brackets that just came out. So Pat, let's start with Division I, which is where you've kind of done the majority of your game coverage this year. So these are teams that you've seen. Taunton gets the number 1 seed, which I don't know that we even had them as number 1 all year.
No, they were number 1 for a handful of weeks, kind of around mid-April, maybe late April, early May. It was kind of a revolving door. BC High got the nod as the defending champ, and they had a great start to the season, so kind of backed it up. Then I think it went to Taunton after them, or Xaverian after them, then Taunton, who, I slept on going into the year. Taunton quickly shot up the rankings, earned number 1 in due time, and then after Taunton, it was St. John's, Shrewsbury. It might have been Xaverian again. Now it was back to Xaverian last week, and so it was pretty much that revolving cast of that top 3. BC High kind of fell out of that top 4 at the end there, but it's another kind of group of usual suspects that we're used to every year. Last week was super interesting, just all these teams kind of limping to the finish, as I wrote in the rankings. And Taunton held on to the top seed. Wasn't sure if, Bishop Fian had a shot at it. They're red hot. They've kind of won. They've kind of been laying in the weeds all year. Xaverian too, maybe they had a shot at number 1, but Taunton holds on. They'll get the winner of Winchester and Beverly from the preliminary round. There are a handful of pretty intriguing matchups, even in the I can't say that word, the first round. We're just going to say the first round today. Even in that first round, that if you want to call it the play-in round, that whether whoever moves on and faces one of these higher seeds could really give them trouble, or even, in the round of 32, there are a handful that stick out right off the bat. I guess I'll just kind of, right off the bat, St. John's, Shrewsbury is the number 2. Could get Lincoln Sudbury if they beat Peabody, and Lincoln Sudbury, have kind of been in the mix outside of our top 10. They're not as good as last season's team, but they still got a handful of, really good players. Mason Tarantino, is one that comes to mind. And one that I think could, give a number 2 seed a really good test. You got, right off the bat, it's like Lawrence and North Andover in the round of 32. And I think Lawrence has split with North Andover this year, if not swept them, off the top of my head. And, they're in the same conference, and they're 2 teams that have been really strong throughout the year. North Andover has been in and out of the top 10. Lawrence has kind of been in that mix just outside. And even Xaverian, as the 5th seed, could get Catholic Memorial at number 28 if they happen to come out over Malden. And, CM is, we talked about them in the midseason report. CM's been one of the more interesting teams all season. They'll have, they'll kind of flop one game, and then they'll beat the best team in the state the next game. And again, one of those battle-tested Catholic Conference teams, even outside of the top 3 or 4, that could give anybody a run.
Yeah, you hear the coaches say they hate those league matchups in the state tournament. They always want to see teams out of their league. They don't want to play a team for the 3rd time. But yeah, those sound like good Merrimack Valley and Catholic Conference potential matchups, depending on what happens in that preliminary round. I'm surprised to see Fian got all the way up to number 3 here. That's, I didn't realize they finished 17-4, because at one point they were maybe 5-4 or something like that.
Yeah, they're a little over 500, I'd say, through April, and then just really April 25th on caught fire. They won 8 in a row, or maybe it was 9 in a row. They've won, I think they won 11 of their last 12, and there were some really good wins in there. They took a rematch with St. Mary's. They beat Xaverian this past week. I'm pretty sure they beat Taunton this past week, and so we talk about who's playing their best ball at the right time, and Fian certainly is, and Andrew, it hasn't even been just Andrew Shute on the mound. He's obviously the big name, but Jack Gassie's someone who's been really good as a serviceable arm behind Andrew Shute. They haven't had Brody Bumilla really. Randon May has been a key bat. Finn McHale. You go down the list, and they've kind of gotten contributions from everybody. But the biggest thing I think has been the pitching behind Andrew Shute. We've kind of harped on it going into the season, mid-season. They haven't had Brody Bumilla, who's obviously the big headlining prospect. But even outside of Andrew Shute, Jack Gassey has been a huge contributor for them, and just really steady performances each time he's out there. So that's kind of what you look for in the tournament is, you're going to get a good game out of your ace. And, it comes down to, all right, the next game, who's going to pitch? Who's going to come through? Do you have someone who can take the ball for you in that scenario? And it seems like they do.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like they're going to have Brody Bumilla on the mound at all. From what I can tell, you haven't seen him pitch at all, have you?
No, and it kind of, it's hard to get to those games down there. I think they're in North Attleboro.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen them since they played St. Mary's up in Lynn. And he was still batting, but I've just been going through their box scores, and they haven't been with him in the lineup at all.
Yeah, so it's amazing that they still were able to run it to 17-4 under Joe Breen in his first year as the head coach there. He's a Stonehill College grad and a big-time coach in the travel ball scene, too. I was just actually texting with him this week because the Stonehill head coaching position just became open, which I think will be a attractive, high-profile position now that it's a Division I program. But that is neither here nor there. We're back talking about MIAA brackets here. So as I'm looking at this, some matchups that I'm kind of have my eye on here as interesting stuff, and you named a few. Braintree-Weymouth as a potential 8 versus 9 matchup, and Leominster is Weymouth's first-round opponent, and Leominster has had a lot of tournament success over the years, always a tough team under Coach Barnaby. So those are some teams that kind of stand out. You mentioned the Lawrence-North Andover matchup. Look at Bishop Feehan with a potential matchup against Chelmsford. If Chelmsford advances past Shrewsbury, that could be a 3 versus 14. We know Chelmsford has Matt Stewart as a pitcher. He's 90+ on the mound. If somehow they can get by Shrewsbury without using him as the pitcher, that's a really good matchup. Any of these other matchups, Franklin looks like they got in as a 12 seed. They're always tough in the tournament. Any of these lower seeds you kind of see making some noise? Yeah,
I mean, so Chelmsford, you mentioned Matt Stewart as a pitcher, and even as a power bat. Shrewsbury is interesting. They just beat St. John's Shrewsbury this past week. Is that a galvanizing thing for them? And, they've been pretty good. I think they're in the Midwalk Conference. I don't want to speak out of turn, all these conferences, but Shrewsbury's had a good year as the 19 seed. One I look at is St. John's Prep and Newton South. We talked about South a little bit at the midseason report. They the big start to the season dipped a little bit. They're kind of back on the rise here. So we talk about being in good form. Springfield Central as a 25 seed against Braintree. It's obviously a lot of the bias is towards Eastern Mass and some of those Metro West teams, but and Western Mass, kind of west of Worcester, gets lost in the shuffle. But Springfield Central's been awesome out in Western Mass. Gabriel Miranda's been fantastic at the plate. Elia Martinez Rosario behind the plate and hitting as well. He's batting. Last I checked, he was hitting .442, just having a great season. And even on the mound, Frankie Torres and Aiden Archibald have had great years too. So one of those teams that as Braintree and Eastern Mass team might not know a ton about a Springfield Central. I'd keep an eye out there. Leominster, like you said, they play a really tough schedule. They made some noise last year, and they had a good group of returners this year. They're one to watch as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Springfield Central. I was just pulling up my text message from Braintree coach Bill O'Connell because I know they have been hit hard by the injury bug this year. So Max DeRoche needs Tommy John surgery. He's the ace at Braintree, and then their best player, Pete Brooks, who's a 2026, tore his hamstring. So it's amazing how well Braintree has kind of pieced it together here at the end of the season to kind of stay up in the rankings and relevant. They just won their Memorial Day tournament too, which was Donnie Frederick's tournament. So Braintree has held it together, but like you said, Springfield Central is playing tough. That could be an upset alert, on that game, especially with Braintree's injuries. Let's take a look. Let's try to narrow this down to 4 teams as you're looking at the bracket here. Like if you were to go with a final 4, is there anybody that you think? I mean, Braintree is probably the biggest threat to Taunton, but like you said, Springfield Central could make some noise. Weymouth is right there. Leominster. Taunton doesn't have the easiest road to the semifinals, but what do you think? Do you think they're going to get through to the Final Four?
Oh, that's tough. I'd have to give the edge to Taunton. They've just been so consistent this year. Anyone else out of that kind of quadrant, I'd go with Weymouth. Braintree, like we said, the injury bug is hard to overlook. I know I was really bullish on them at the start of the season in the midseason report. The injuries are tough. Luke Joyce is obviously a horse, and he's been doing his thing both at the mound and at the plate. But it's we talk about who's going to get the ball the next game, and can you rely on, others to step up? So that's just the question mark there. Weymouth, I think, has been really good, especially as a 9 seed. I'd come down between them and Taunton in that area. It's hard to look past Xaverian in their half of the bracket, or their kind of quadrant, if you want to call it that.
They're the 5, so they would have to get through
King Philip, and even Franklin.
Yeah, you're right. Franklin's a tough matchup too.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a deep part of the bracket. I think Xaverian, I know they're the 5th seed, but they've been arguably the top team. I think they're on the balance of the season. At various times they've been number 1 in our rankings. It's hard to look past the schedule they've played. They're obviously battle tested, and they've made the most of it too. So I'd look at Xaverian there. Bishop Fian, you want to lean towards the hot hand. I'd also give a shout to Andover, and also Wellesley and North Quincy is a really good matchup too. North Quincy had an awesome start to the year. They were kind of hanging around there early on, so I wouldn't look past them if I'm Wellesley. So Bishop Fian, and it kind of probably comes down to them and Andover. I think Fian is just harping on the hot hand. It's hard to look past them, and then moving up, I hate to keep going like chalk, but St. John's, they have a St. John's Shrewsbury that has a pretty tough half of the bracket. They could get BC High in the round of 16. St. John's Prep is in there. That's probably one they'll have to go through. Attleboro is obviously no slouch. I don't know. The St. John's Shrewsbury is kind of in that Xaverian echelon of arguably number 1 in the state throughout the season. And you it's hard to look past the track record there, but if you want to give an edge like we did for Bishop Fian, St. John's Prep is also playing some of their best baseball at the right time.
Yeah, that's a really tough little quadrant of the bracket there. Now that I'm looking at it, you got St. John's Prep, you got BC High as a potential 2 versus 15, and like you said earlier, Lincoln Sudbury in the first round. That is a tricky one for St. John's Shrewsbury, but you're probably smart to go pretty much chalk. I mean, Xaverian's the 5th seed, so that wouldn't be exactly as seeded, but it has Division 1. You see that a lot of years where it's a little bit closer to as seeded all the way through, whereas some of these other brackets get a little more interesting with upsets. All right, so let's kind of play that out. So you get Taunton versus Xaverian and St. John Shrewsbury versus Fian. Let's say, is that the way you had it there? 1, 2, 3, and 5 making it to the Final Four?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So who do you like, Taunton versus Xaverian?
I'm going to go Xaverian.
Yeah, like you said, they've had that great year and been kind of answering the bell all year.
Yeah. Paul McCarthy has been awesome this year. We talked about the 1-2 punch with Pat Rhodes, and Pat Rhodes' numbers haven't really been as sparkling as they have in years past, but just the pedigree of a guy like that, and also whether it's other arms behind him like that have gotten it done. Abe Anderson's one that comes to mind. Xaverian has those guys even outside of their A's.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Paul McCarthy could be a guy who is a finalist for MIAA Player of the Year. We name one. We pick 10 finalists every year, and then we name the one. And we'll probably do that the next time we sit down. This one's just to kind of react to the brackets. But as we get later in the tournament, we'll kind of talk about our 10 finalists, and then talk about what guys did in the tournament, which is really where you kind of separate yourself and become the Player of the Year. Over the last 2 years, I think we had 2 state champions. We had the kid from Milton a couple of years ago who ended up going to NESCAC school and had a really good career. Owen something, but and then last year, who did we have? Plymouth North.
Yeah, we had DC Brown last year from Newton North. He was, we had our top 10 finalists, and I had a little honorable mention at the bottom. He was in the honorable mention and just had such an unbelievable tournament. He vaulted himself to Player of the Year. Like you said, that's not uncommon this time of year.
Yeah. All right. So that we played that one out. You like Xaverian, and you like? Did you say St. John Shrewsbury?
St. John Shrewsbury.
Okay.
I don't remember my predictions at the midseason report, so if I'm contradicting myself, it's not the best look. But right now, I'd have to go Xaverian and St. John Shrewsbury in that final, and I don't know. It's hard to go against Xaverian after all I've been hyping them up so far in this. But St. John Shrewsbury has been fantastic. Connor Seacrest, Jack Forges, just a kind of a murderer's row. I think we've said that about them before, and I'd have to give the edge to maybe St. John Shrewsbury in that scenario.
Yeah, they have the pedigree too. They were in that championship game last year, so
a little feel-good story there.
Yeah, that experience could definitely help. Just to clarify, Milton High's Owen McHugh was our MIAA Player of the Year 2 years ago. I remembered Owen. I couldn't remember the last name, but he's playing, I think, both baseball and football in college. So interesting story there. All right, let's take a look at Division II now. And this one, we're probably not going to spend quite as much time on these other divisions just because, you are seeing a lot of Division I games this year. But as we look in Division II, it's a lot of the same usual suspects from last year. Plymouth North is the defending champion. They got the 1 seed. Walpole was also in the championship game last year with them. They're the 4 seed, so those teams could potentially meet in the semifinals. What are your reactions just to kind of taking a look at this bracket? What caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, Plymouth North, as a team that was in our top 5 for a lot of May, in the top 10 pretty much throughout the season. I don't think they ever fell out. They're a team that, whether they're going against the D1 or you got St. Mary's in D3, whoever they're going against, you like their chances, even if it's a BC High that they're going against or whoever from, that upper echelon of D1. So, at 16-4, obviously another awesome season, even with losing DC Brown, really depth just between Matt Nardone, Will Novak, Henry Novick, and then so there's clear, obviously to see why they got the number 1 seed there. Reading's one that caught my eye, kind of, storming up late in the season. Ryan Marino's been fantastic on the mound for them. And as the number 2 seed, they'll get either West Springfield or Neshoba regional. You kind of like their chances there. I'd look at Whitman Hanson as an 18 seed. They're in that Patriot Conference or that Patriot League with, Plymouth North, Duxbury, Plymouth South. So playing a good schedule. Hopkinton's obviously been a good D2 contender these last couple of years with Nick Pedroli. And just Whitman Hanson's one I wouldn't overlook as a lower seed. North Attleboro, kind of another Hockomock team that, obviously Taunton, King Philip, Franklin, those teams get a lot of the hype, but North Attleboro had a really solid season, kind of biding its time there. Milton, just a year removed from back-to-back titles. Scott Longo's still there doing his thing. Another kind of deep lineup that, if they get hot at the right time or you get favorable matchups, it's hard to look past them. Milford had a really good start to the season, kind of tapered off, but, kind of in that tier of, you don't want to overlook them either. Duxbury's one that for a while was pushing as an undefeated team through the first, month plus and, really challenging Plymouth North and the Patriot. And, whether it's Jack Carney, some other guys, they've put together a really just good season, well-rounded. They've gotten some good production, some quality wins in there. Duxbury's one too. And Walpole's interesting. Walpole is one shows you how much kind of at least as far as the seeding and the power rankings, how much schedule matters. Because they're 10-9. That might not jump off the page, but they've played a gauntlet in that Bay State Conference. So they're one to watch, obviously, as the 4 seed.
Yeah, I was going to say I would watch out for any of these 500-ish record teams that are up there at the top, like Walpole is at number 4 with a 10-9 record, because that just means, the strength of schedule has been so difficult that the MIA's ranking system, boosted them over teams that have way more wins below. There's a 14-6 team Grafton all the way down to 20, so that just kind of tells me maybe they saw a lot of D3 and D4 opponents throughout the year. But yeah, you want to watch out for these teams that are right around 500 with high seeds, because obviously they played, as you say, a gauntlet of a schedule. Netting Professionals is proud to be the official netting partner of the Cape Cod League and the New England Collegiate Baseball League. Netting Professionals is in the sports business of improving athletic programs one facility at a time. Netting Professionals designs, fabricates, and installs custom netting, wall padding, windscreen, batting practice equipment, and much more for high schools, colleges, commercial facilities, and stadiums throughout the United States while providing high-quality products and great service to numerous baseball programs throughout the New England area. To learn more and to speak to a netting professionals representative today, visit them at nettingpros.com. Remember, when it comes to netting, it's netting professionals. Get the pro treatment and design your very own custom Rawlings glove, just like your favorite big league stars. Choose from countless patterns, web types, lace colors, and more to showcase your unique personal style. Start with a pro design and change it up with your team colors, or build yours completely from scratch with your name, number, and state flag. Visit Rawlings.com to design your custom glove today. Yeah, so Plymouth North, defending champions, and they lost, graduated the MIAA Player of the Year, and look at them right back at number one. If you were to pick a Final Four here, and Duxbury, I like you say, they could be a really tough opponent for Plymouth North in a 1-8 matchup. But semifinals, if you were to pick 4 teams out of here to kind of get through, and then maybe give us one upset that you see that, maybe just a lower seeded team that you think is going to pull off an upset.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna go Plymouth North in that top side, the top left. It's tough, Walpole. I think this is where like we said, the schedule kind of matters. You're battle tested. You know what it takes kind of in these tougher scenarios. I'd go Walpole in that bottom left. Then the right side is kind of interesting. North Attleboro, obviously in the Hockomock, battle tested. We kind of harp on that. Milton's in there. I'm going to go Milton as the 11 seed.
Oh,
Maybe
wow.
that's just a little recency bias with a bunch of guys with experience from those titles and stuff. And, they still have Scott Longo. He's the big name there. Top right is really interesting to me, that part of the bracket. Canton has some good wins. I'm going to go Whitman Hanson as an 18 seed over Reading in that round of 16. And I think I'm going to take, it's tough because Reading's playing such great baseball right now. They're one of the teams I highlighted last week, playing their best ball at the right time. And, I hate to go against them, but I did just pump up Whitman Hanson a little bit. But I don't know, my head's kind of telling me Reading. My heart might kind of wants to take Whitman Hanson. I'm going to go Reading. So a little chalky again, Plymouth North, Walpole, Milton as an 11, and then Reading as a 2.
Yeah, so I guess Milton's your upset. And yeah, it's always tough. Like, it's a tough juggling act there for Milton, because if they can get to that second round game and without using Scott Longo, then you never know. You could pull off an upset in the second round and then make some noise. They have obviously an ace that can match up with anybody in Scott Longo. He's going to Northeastern next year, and he's got a big game experience. A lot of those state championships, he was on the mound for key games throughout those runs. All right, so you've got Reading, you've got Milton, and then you've got Plymouth North and Walpole. That'll be a great semifinal matchup, a rematch of last year's state championship if it does end up playing out. It's funny with the Reading choice, like you want to give them their credit for having a great year, and so you don't want to pick against them. But sometimes, we pick against a team, and then you hear when you're sitting there watching them celebrate a championship, like nobody picked us, and you're like, all right, well, maybe we helped them a little bit.
Yes, it's all personal when we pick against your team. It's targeted, and it's personal.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's play this one out. Plymouth North versus Walpole, rematch of last year's state championship. Who do you like in that game?
It's boring. I'm going to go Plymouth North. I think they've just kind of, shown a higher ceiling throughout the season.
Yeah, they've been up. They've responded every time they've been tested this year. To finish 16-4 with losing the talent they did last year is impressive. And then you got Reading, the 2 seed, versus Milton, 11. Who knows if Scott Longo's available in this game? It depends on the strategy, but who do you like in that one?
I'm gonna go Milton because even if they don't have Scott Longo, Ryan Kelly, when they played Weymouth, and I saw them, it was last week I think, and Ryan Kelly had wasn't a sparkling final line, but still made some good pitches, had some good stuff out there. So he's an arm to watch, and even behind the plate, like Nick, I hope I say this right, Nick Antoniewicz, Just some impressive throws behind the plate. And, they've got a good lineup at Milton, even outside of Scott Longo, who we've kind of harped on here. But yeah, I think Milton and Harry Hinkle too is one as well. Milton's got that pedigree of the Bay State Conference, and whichever guys outside of Scott Longo are left from those championship teams, just having that experience and sort of that tougher schedule at their sales.
So Milton would enter that game as champions in 2022 and 2023. Plymouth North would be 2024 with a chance to even it with 2 state championships for each program over the last 4 years. Do you like Plymouth North to pull that off?
I do. I think they've been the best team wire to wire so far in D2, and sometimes that doesn't always bode well for you in the tournament, but I think they've shown one of the higher ceilings here.
Okay. We're not going to spend quite as much time. Like I said, we haven't had as much time to see these programs outside of Division I and Division II. Let's just take a quick peek. This will be my first look at these brackets, so part of me is just curious as to what it looks like. St. Mary's is the number 1 seed in Division III. They were in the state championship. Yeah, they were in the state championship game last year. I think they won it 2 years ago. And they've got Avon Cabral at Northeastern having a great season too. So it's a big year for the St. Mary's program with both alumni and the current players having breakout seasons. St. Mary's has the Doney brothers. One is a left-handed pitcher, one is a catcher. One of the best batteries in the MIAA at any division. As we look through here in Division III, anything catch your eye?
Yeah, Weston as an 8 seed, they were another one that was, undefeated for a really long time, and it took until, maybe May for them to take their first loss. So those are, that's a team you kind of always pay attention to the rest of the way. Norwell's one we haven't really given a lot of press this year, but, has had a really strong year. I'm drawing a blank on the names, but they've had a handful of guys who've been in and out of our peak performers on a given week. Foxborough is one as well in the Hockomock. You kind of always look at them. Bishop Stang is one that's really interesting in that Catholic Central with St. Mary's and Bishop Fian. I think they have a win over Fian, and they may have a win over St. Mary's, or maybe it's vice versa. And but Stang's one to watch there. Holliston, I think it is a 21 seed, is pretty interesting, especially with I believe it's Reese Engel or Lucas Engel. So they've been one that's been really strong this year. Sandwich as well is one to watch. But it's kind of like even Oakmont is I was telling you this off air. Oakmont is a 34 seed. I highlighted them last week as playing, some of their best ball at the right time, one we kind of haven't really. They've kind of flown under the radar for us. Whether obviously they lost big names, Kalen Lavelle and the Curtis brothers, but there's still plenty of guys there. Johnny Lasordo was awesome in last year's championship. Jake O'Day, Levi Hessel, JJ Walker. So Oakmont is. One of maybe the most interesting 34 seed in the entire D1 through D5 of the MIAA brackets.
Yeah.
And if they make it through, Norwell's going to have their hands full. Oakmont's going for a 3-peat. And, it wouldn't surprise me to see them make a run, but St. Mary's is kind of in that Plymouth North boat where, St. Mary's was top 5 at times in our rankings this year. They never left the top 10, even outside of the Doney brothers. And, they got Jaden Driscoll in the infield. Michael DeMano's been really catching fire of late. Jack Zimmerman is one behind Josh Doney, who just double-digit strikeouts, it feels like, every game for him. He's one that can really, step up even when it's not Josh Doney's day. So it's tough to look past St. Mary's.
Yeah, I actually have a good amount of experience covering MIAA Division III tournament baseball because I used to write for... I started with the Gloucester Daily Times. The Gloucester Fishermen are in this bracket, number 10 seed at 19-1. Look out for them. I like them to make a little bit of noise. They could have a 7 matchup against Sandwich, and then they'll be up against Norwell, like you said, as the 2 if they can get through Sandwich. But look out for the Gloucester Fishermen. Another one I like here is Newburyport at number 36. They have, if they can get by Hudson, they would have Shawsheen Valley Tech, a 4 seed in the second round. Now, Shawsheen Valley Tech was 20-0, but the fact that they're
haven't even gotten to them yet.
Yeah, the fact that they're the 4 seed tells me maybe their strength of schedule wasn't quite as high if they finished undefeated and still only got the 4 seed. So I like Newburyport. Newburyport was in the state championship game 3 years ago when Austin Prep won the championship. Newburyport has a really good coach with Mark Rowe. I used to write in Newburyport, and he was at Georgetown for a number of years. He's a Newburyport alum, but when he was coaching Georgetown, he always used to make these deep runs in the Division IV tournament as like the 20 seed or the 18 seed, and he'd go deep. So he's got experience making these deep tournament runs. So keep an eye on Newburyport with a potential upset with a 36 beating a 4. I also like Pentucket is a 30 seed. They would have Foxborough, and if they can get through that preliminary round game, so that would be a tough matchup versus number 3. But those are some of the lower seeds, just from my experience being out covering Division III, kind of on the North Shore in Massachusetts. Those are teams that used to historically make some deep program runs.
Yeah.
And you like Oakmont at 34.
Yeah, I'd also point out Tewksbury at 27 with Phil Lombardi, and then Shawsheen, completely forgot about them, is 20-0. They're outside of I think Pioneer Valley out in Western Mass. Shawsheen is the only other undefeated team in the state, and it's really fun to run through their box scores because any given day it's 4 or 5 guys having video game outings, and it's Will Track, Cole Pellegrino, Lucas Poirier, Dylan Pratt, Will Holloway, Robbie Welch. It's just the list goes on and on of any given box score you look at for Shawsheen, and it's everybody's getting their fill. And like you said about the schedule this year, and we've kind of said it throughout the show how much schedule seems to matter for these seedings. But your schedule is your schedule. You play what's in front of you, and they've made the most of it. So it's another you want to give an undefeated team an edge, but even then everything kind of goes back to St. Mary's where they've just been as good as any of the D1 teams we've talked about.
Yeah, I'd say St. Mary's has kind of got to be the favorite for sure. And then, who knows? With some of these, you don't really always get like the 1, 2, 3, 4 advancing to the semifinals. I'm not going to make you pick 4 just because it's really hard to do once you get in these lower brackets where you see a lot of double-digit seeds kind of make some noise and make deep runs. But, you like St. Mary's, you think, in that one?
Yeah, tough to go against them.
Okay, I'm just looking at Division IV here. I don't know if we've covered any team in here at all this year or had them in the top 10. So we're probably limited on the info here, but I'm just going to kind of give them a shout out. Pittsfield got the number 1 seed with a 16-4 ranking. Linfield is a Cape Ann League team. Hamilton Wenham, another Cape Ann League team at 2 and 3 respectively. St. John Paul, the second at 19 and 2 as a 4 seed. Seekonk is a defending state champion, I think.
Yep.
They win Division 4,
Yep.
so they're at the 6th seed. At 12 and 8. Anything jump out to you there in Division 4?
Yeah, Seekonk is a 6 with Tyler Kroppis is their big prospect, and Javi Borges is someone who was awesome in last year's state championship, has kind of rolled into this season as one of their younger guys, really coming into his own. Pittsfield, like we said, those Western Mass teams kind of get lost in the shuffle for us. Linfield, without Tyler Adamo this season, has really put together a nice season. And St. John Paul II, down there in, I believe, Hyannis, they were, it was them and Shawsheen undefeated in Eastern Mass until, maybe 2 weeks ago. And, another team that's sometimes putting together these insane performances, like a 30-0 win. I feel like I saw one time, just feels like, again, your schedule is your schedule, and they've, like Shawsheen, they've made their most of it. And, even no matter who it's against, capable of probably just popping off for an obscene number of runs in a given time, which is maybe all you need in one of these scenarios.
Yeah, for sure. Seekonk, I remember Tyler Kroppis last year was like video game. I think he struck out more than 100 batters in a single season, and he was right in the running for MIAA Player of the Year too. He's like one of the only kids I've ever seen commit to this school. I think he's committed to like East Tennessee State or something like that. So you don't see that all the time in Massachusetts. All right, let's take one quick glance at Division 5, and then we're going to close out the podcast here. Taking a look at Division 5, ooh, man. English is number 2 seed with 17-5. Pioneer Valley at 20-0 is the 1 seed. Anything really jump out to you here? Do you know anything about any of these schools?
I do not. I know Pioneer Valley Regional is the only undefeated team left standing with Shawsheen. So it's, you got Pioneer Valley out in Western Mass, Shawsheen out in Eastern Mass. English High is obviously the one to circle as the defending champ. And, I think they graduated David Castillo last year, who had a phenomenal season. But, they still got, plenty of contributors back. Manny DeJesus, Luis Mejia. And, they've as for, the Boston City League teams, Boston Latins had a solid year, and, English has played, Lincoln Sudbury, they have a win over them. They've played St. Mary's. That was a 9-6 loss. They've beaten Weston. And they took a win over Newton South. So they're playing sort of these teams up in the higher divisions and kind of proving themselves. So they're defending champions. It's easy to give them the nod. But they're one I would look at as well, and also just capable of pumping out double-digit runs in a single outing.
Right on. All right, well, we are going to skip the 3 up, 3 down segment today because we're a little bit tight for time, but we wanted to get you an immediate reaction to the brackets while it came out. So we appreciate you tuning in. Thanks to our guest, Pat Donnelly, for joining us on the Base Path Podcast. Rate, subscribe, review this podcast on your favorite platform. Thanks to our producer, David Yaz. The Base Path Podcast is a Siemens Media production.